Thank you, Ron. Good morning, everybody. The title, as you can see, is Seen Through the Cloud and Securing Enterprise Cloud Environments, what we're discussing here is the core business of enterprises in their cloud environments. So the often overlooked challenge when it comes to growing business needs that is facilitated by the elasticity of the cloud is issues with risk management, security assurance, et cetera, et cetera. So for that, how do we tackle that is the question we want to address today, my colleague Mark and I, as we take you on Microsoft's journey of how we address these challenges uh, to establish a reasonable amount of security assurance in our corporate cloud environments. With that, a little note of introduction about us, who we are. My name is Bhaskar Ganti. I go by Ganti. I'm a senior security program manager at Microsoft and the organization known as Digital Security and Risk Engineering. I've been in Microsoft for about 2.5 years, and prior to that, I was a strategist and an architect in the SAP platform space, security and governance, risk, and compliance for over 20 years, dealing with regulatory compliance initiatives and re-architecting enterprise SAP platforms for about since the advent of the SOX Act. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark, and we'll be switching back and forth throughout the presentation. Mark, good morning.
Awesome. Thanks, Ganti. My name is Mark Jacobs. Like Ganti, I'm also a senior security program manager at Microsoft. I have been at Microsoft for over 5 years now, but I have been in the security vertical for 20 years. And in those 20 years, I have worn many, many hats, from administrator to engineer to architect to education and awareness, policy, incident response. If there was something related to security, I've probably seen it. And also, I'm probably not surprised by much of anything anymore. So I'm excited today to talk about our journey in the cloud. And the reason for that is that's where I work and have been working at Microsoft. We are in a special spot within the enterprise. And in my role at Microsoft, I have been working on the emerging space, working on requirements, pushing those into our products for not only how we do things internally at Microsoft, but also for our customers. And so that's what gets me excited, is to talk about how we do that with you this morning. So let's take a quick look at the agenda today. If we can go to the next slide. We're going to start out talking about our initial journey into the cloud, what we were thinking of Azure at the time, and some of the challenges that we had to overcome. And I'll walk you through how we dealt with that. Then we will move into Ganti's talk on thinking differently about the cloud, scale challenges and governance challenges, and really thinking about risk at scale and how we needed to deal and change our way of thinking. And then finally, as we have time, and as Ron mentioned, we'll answer questions. If we can during the presentation, we'll do that. At the end, we hope to have some time for you as well. And for any of those items that we can't answer for you right here, we'll make sure that we get back to Ron with those answers. So let's go ahead and get started. Early Azure for us was a much different space. If we think back before 2016, we thought of the cloud in much the same model that we are used to, which was the data center. And in the data center centric approach, there's a lot of assumptions that you control everything within that boundary, that security has insight and control over all of the mechanisms and deployments. And it was a much different space. You can see within this slide, security is positioned more as a gatekeeper of sorts, where it's control and telling the teams what needs to be done in terms of requirements and policy. And in some cases, it would push out that policy to people. I remember at the time when we first started talking about the cloud, someone saying, hey, someone needs to stop people from getting and creating new subscriptions and employing resources until we have a handle on this. Security needs to have control over this again. The problem with that is we've already started. So let's go to the next slide here. We found that the train had already left the station. And we also know what happens when you try to build up gates. People are going to find a way to do their work. We had to think differently. And we knew we had to change that model, and we needed to change it according to this new world of cloud that we needed to understand. We needed to understand where the controls were, and we needed to understand how we could model our controls effectively within the new environment and very flexible deployment model of Azure. In early 2017, we focused on a project to understand all the knobs and levers that we needed to secure our most confidential data in Azure. And that led us to a recognition of all of the different spaces that we needed to have controls. Ganti, if we can go to the next slide here, you'll see on the screen an eye chart, but it's a worthwhile eye chart. There's 41 different items on here that span a number of different areas that we identified at the time in our project that were required for us to have a better handle on how we protected our assets within Azure, how we deployed them, and how we established some assurances that the configurations that we needed were in place. Now you'll see here that the columns are divided into 3 areas, from inception and planning. That's our onboarding phase. And that covers a number of things that are unique internally to Microsoft, but you could easily adapt to what your own environment might look like at your enterprise. A lot of onboarding activity there, where you need to make sure that you have the right checks in place when you start thinking about your deployments. We also needed to make sure that we had the right types of credentials in place. If you look at the bottom of that onboarding, there's one called alternate credentials. At Microsoft, we use a number of different identities. We have one that we use for email and our day-to-day work, but we started to think about how do we protect that for some of our administrative work. For that, we use smart cards. So it was a different credential, still tied to me, but on a separate mechanism that allows me to have additional factors of authentication. When we look at the configuration, that's by far the largest list there, and a very important one. We already started that onboarding phase. We moved into configuration. There's a number of things that extend beyond just the resource deployments that we needed to make sure were specifically called out and controlled. The last column was the most eye-opening one for us. When we started to look at the world of DevOps, there's a very important part of DevOps that didn't have as much attention as it should, and that was the ops part. We needed to ensure that those teams that were now accountable for these subscriptions that were being deployed into the cloud, that they knew what they needed to do. We had to conduct tabletops to help teams understand what their responsibility was should they find something suspicious going on within their subscription. They needed to know who to contact. They needed to understand what their security responsibility was, and most importantly, they needed the tools in which to do that. Part of that was an information campaign of educating and making sure that folks were aware of all the resources that were available to them. Now that led us into understanding there are some takeaways that we needed to build in to controlling and helping lead our engineering teams to having a secure Azure environment. The one thing that was most important to us was that we automate as much as possible. If you took a look at that list, you realized there's a lot going on there. Automation would help us scale. Trying to do this individually just wasn't going to cut it. And we had pilot projects with our teams, walking them through each of these areas. And as if you can imagine, it took us weeks and weeks to get through each of those. So we focused then on automating as much as we could, pushing that information in terms of risk assessment as close to the engineer as possible. We also needed to make sure that the tools that we provided them empowered them to understand their environment and to take action on it. We worked on developing processes and tools that could inform them, educate them just in time, and help them take action by providing scripting in order to fix any configuration that wasn't meeting a requirement. Now, continuous assurance, the third one down here, that was a very important learning from us because security had come from very much a waterfall model where we had a project, we looked at the application, we assessed that application and provided the team with feedback on things that they needed to do to secure their application. The problem with that view is it's a snapshot in time. And once you've deployed that application, you need to make sure that it stays secure. Because in any cloud environment, resources can be very dynamic. Changes can be made. If something were changed that could possibly cause a security issue, you need to know about it. And so continuous assurance was a way of detecting drift. Lastly, we wanted to ensure the teams understood their operational tasks, the things that they needed to do, the places that they needed to monitor, and get introduced to the tools that existed within Azure to build into their team processes. Let's move on to the next slide. Our view changed. As you can see here, the model expanded from one where security was in the middle of everything, calling the shots, having the controls, having that oversight, but also the control to make changes or stop changes. Security in this new view became a partnership between feature teams, operational teams, DevOps teams. So instead of gates, we moved to a model of oversight, visibility, and reporting. Now, it takes a lot of people to make this work. Within the Microsoft enterprise, we have a concept called cloud leads. Cloud leads are security champions, but they also wear other hats too. They are the points of contact that were assigned to each of the organizations within the enterprise to help be the conveyor of awareness and information, but also to help facilitate questions and get solutions for their teams should they have some needs within Azure or security or just knowing what to do next. So it took a great partnership from all the teams to get all the good information, but also the tools out to them in a way that helped educate and promote what was needed within their Azure environment. All of this led to a tool called the DevOps Toolkit, which is something that we use today. And in the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how we do that. The DevOps Toolkit is a PowerShell module at its core. What it was designed to do was to help facilitate those 41 different areas by pushing automation to the teams. And the way it does that is it uses different components within that kit to not only enable teams to scan their resources and understand the security state of them, but also to create an automation that enables them to detect drift over time. Walking through these 6 components, the first one is our focal point for most of the day-to-day operations that happen within our enterprise. In the subscription security, we look at how a subscription is configured, from the resources that are deployed inside and those configurations, and also the identities that have access through role-based access control, the owners of it, and whether those permissions are over-permissioned or just right. It measures the required configurations of many different services that are deployed within Azure. We also have components within the kit that help our developers in real time through a Visual Studio plugin that help them with coding and making sure that they are doing the right thing and offering suggestions. We also had a process that was leveraged as an extension with Azure DevOps, formerly known as Visual Studio Online, that helped with resource deployments. It, like the subscription security, offered scanning of resource deployments before they're actually built into the cloud environment, making suggestions, helping with those deployments, and either breaking the build or just giving the information so teams can adjust accordingly. That fourth component, continuous assurance, we talked about. At its core, that's an automation account. And what its purpose is to detect the drift by setting up a scan schedule within the subscription to look at the resources and report back. We also wanted to make sure that the teams had the resources for monitoring their subscriptions. So within the kit, we created an alerting function so that teams could be informed of operational tasks that were happening in their environment, but also making sure that the levers and mechanisms that existed within their subscription through tools like Azure Security Center were in place. And then lastly, with this, we get lots of information. We understand the resource deployments, and we understand new types of resources that may be coming into the environment that we need to start making a decision on. From it, we can make risk-based decisions based upon that data. All of this has been very helpful within the enterprise, and our scope of the enterprise has greatly changed, where instead of looking at our hundreds of subscriptions, we started to expand that scope well beyond just our core subscriptions, but all of the subscriptions within our corporate tenant, which includes hundreds of thousands of subscriptions. So you can imagine scale changed the way we started to think. And with that, I'll turn my attention over to Ganti, who can walk us through some of the mindset changes that were required as we started to scale up.
Thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me?
Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you. So, tragedy of the commons. Since Ron was dating himself for the angel beat where the name came from, I'll date myself to 320 BC. Aristotle famously was quoted to saying, "What is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care." So that's the tragedy of commons. And how do we avoid it in this perspective? Because the scale has drastically changed, which means we have to address multiple verticals within Microsoft and multiple divisions within each vertical. That leads to hundreds of thousands of subscriptions, which is a change from just a few hundred subscriptions, which we piloted, to and tens of thousands of management groups and a multitude of resources. So how do we ensure that we can see through these things, establish visibility, and come up with a comprehensive approach that is agreed to by all the cloud leads across Microsoft as an enterprise and the conduct of its business, core businesses? So as you can see, the only approach we decided is to take a risk-based approach, which makes the most sense through a bow tie analysis, right? Because 80% of all the problems stem from about 20% 20% of the issues. So with that in mind, we figured what are the risks that are common to everyone across the enterprise, and we took those common risks and brought them to the table so that everybody has an agreement to that. And then we have went about identifying what are the control objectives that would meet and mitigate these risks, and what are the agreed upon SLAs for the remediation. So alignment when it comes to all of these aspects with everybody brings a holistic approach across the enterprise in tackling the tenant, the core business tenant of Microsoft that can be translated to other tenants in a continuous service improvement approach. So what we had to do after that was we have to define actionable milestones and split it into work streams so that we can achieve what we need to with key success indicators. And we are governed on this matter with a few principles and a few questions that we had to ask ourselves. How do we see inside? So first part, the work streams we have divided into four aspects: visibility, auditability, cleanup and remediation, and then enforcement. In the visibility aspect, how do we see inside? We decided to go the approach of establishing a read-only role-based access model, a managed identity at the root of the corporate tenant, which percolated down to individual subscriptions. That enabled us to see what we can see across all the subscriptions within the corporate tenant. And then it gave us the ability to scan the entire tenant's inventory of all the subscriptions and resources within and visualize it. After that comes the audit. So from an audit perspective, we aligned prior to this, as I spoke earlier, on the common risks and the common control objectives that form the baseline. So now we have a prioritized view. How do we bring these priorities into view and keep our eye on the ball and establish metrics, what we can see, what percentage can we see, and how do we go about measuring these things and giving us a view, a comprehensive view on all these subscriptions within the tenant. That was the auditability work stream that we have put forth. And then so that we could effectively move to the cleanup state and the remediation state. The difference between the cleanup and the remediation is compliance focused. Cleanup is pretty much unwanted subscriptions, unwanted management groups, the orphaned aspects of it that needs to be taken out of the corporate tenant, which in the first place don't have any business to being there. So that is the approach we took about it. There are two sub pillars within that, the cleanup and remediation pillar. So we went about that and we cleaned up many subscriptions and management groups and certain resources within these subscriptions. And then we started the telemetry and the reporting to various organizations and the divisions within Microsoft so they can go about doing it within the agreed upon SLAs across the enterprise that I alluded to in the previous slide. And we have established Power BI dashboards and other aspects to effectively manage compliance as well. And the last work stream is enforcement. Enforcement is about starting secure and stay secure. This is stay green model. So how do we agree on a set of control objectives that we spoke about in the last slide that we can enforce within the corporate environment so that any new subscriptions that get spun up within the tenant, they start secure and stay secure, and we have a way of managing their drift through our dashboards. So we have established that as a last work stream, and that pretty much leads to the clear definition of metrics and how effectively do we keep our metrics on point so that they're meaningful, actionable, and smart. With that, I will turn it over to my colleague Mark again to discuss the logic behind how we came up with metrics that are meaningful to us.
Thanks, Ganti. So we had a scale challenge. When we start to talk about tenants, and for those not familiar with the structure of Azure, there's many different layers of boundaries. Tenant is a very large one where you can have numbers of subscriptions within it that are aligned to it. And within subscriptions, you can have resources and so on. And so it's different layers of structure, tenant being a very large structure. For us, we needed to understand from that macro level down to the micro level. And we wanted to understand things in such a way to help drive our decision making. We first needed to start at the large scale by understanding what did we have within this tenant? What kind of subscriptions existed? And were those subscriptions aligned to particular divisions within Microsoft to establish some accountability? Were there any subscriptions that didn't have an associated alignment with a division that were just created in there? We also looked at how many management groups were in there. That's another layer which establishes organization of subscriptions. But management groups are another structure that we need to understand. How many of those were organized and associated with divisions and how many were not? How many had subscriptions that were parented to them? So we were trying to make sure that we facilitated getting the data that was necessary for us then to make some decisions about what to do next. Some of the work streams that Ganti mentioned on the last slide mentioned that cleanup effort. We needed to, within those subscriptions, get counts and amounts. That was important to establish what kinds of resources existed. Did we have a lot of virtual machines? Did we have a lot of storage accounts? What about key vaults? How many app services existed? And who were the owners? And where were these aligned? We wanted to ensure that we understood identities. So the different types of accounts, not only the one that I use for my day-to-day email, but the identity that I might use for administrative work or even service principals. Then we start getting down to the micro level. This was extremely important to understand some of the decision making needed then for configuration. We wanted to know on the resource level what kinds of policies existed. The reason why that's important is just like thinking about group policy, if you have within your organizational unit, OU, a section of that OU that doesn't have any policies deployed to it, you're not getting a lot of information back. And that works the same way in Azure, where if you don't have a policy that is assigned to that scope, you're not going to get any information back regarding the state of that policy against those resources. So we wanted to know where those policies existed, and more importantly, how those policies assignments were associated with Azure Security Center. That's the ASC that you see on this slide, so that we knew which of those recommendations would then flow through that solution within Azure. Lastly, we wanted to drill into some of the resource configurations, looking at the resources themselves, how they're structured, the types of extensions that might be deployed on them, really getting the facts and data. From all of that, we can make risk-based decisions by having different work streams developed to understand and clean up, but also then to tackle those bigger issues, making sure that people are effectively securing their resources with network security groups and configurations within their applications, and leveraging the flexibility, but also the powerful solutions that exist within Azure. All of this is leading into where we're going and what we're doing right now within our tenant. So if we go into the next slide, we have been modeling our path forward based upon the early learnings of Azure with the DevOps toolkit, the many controls that were already existing there based upon all the time and the research we had done to make sure that we had the right controls identified And we're moving and still in the process of, for some of the remaining controls, of creating custom policies out of that. We have built-in policies that we have worked with our product teams to develop and push into solutions like Azure Policy and Azure Security Center. And we also have worked with our product teams to ensure that we had a mechanism to onboard those custom policies that we identified within those same places. Ultimately, what we are establishing on our tenant is a consistent way of evaluating our resources by pushing a consistent initiative that contains all of the required controls at the various highest level of our tenant, which is called root, and letting Azure do the evaluation work for us by leveraging policy, showing those policy recommendations through tools like Azure Security Center Secure Score. And this is bound by the organizational structure that we have through management groups, where you're able to organize those subscriptions according to divisions or whatever makes sense for your enterprise. For us, if you think about how many thousands of subscriptions exist in our tenant, we chose to have a structure that's based upon division because it just made sense from an organizational standpoint. And from there, we're able to also leverage management groups as a scoping mechanism. That allows us then to get information about which areas need more attention. And it drives then accountability, and it drives that risk-based approach so that we can ensure that we are handling our resources and securing them accordingly. So we're excited to continue this work. The thing that excites me the most is the way that we've approached this is we are thinking about how we do things within our own enterprise so that the same tools and the mechanisms that we're using are also available for our customers, and showing our customers then how we can achieve the same thing on their subscriptions and their tenants. With that, we are happy to take more questions if you have them. Ron, I don't know if you've received any other questions there, but we can spend some time there if that's okay.